I should have known something was wrong when the third guy in a row looked at me like I was a mistake he couldn't afford to make, like just standing next to me might cost him something he wasn't ready to lose. And I remember forcing a laugh, pretending I didn't notice the way his hand trembled around his coffee cup, pretending I didn't hear the way his voice dropped when he said maybe we should keep things casual. Because casual had never felt like a warning before, it had never sounded like an exit line rehearsed in fear. And the worst part was I told myself it was coincidence, just bad luck, just another failed attempt at moving on from something that had never even been real in the first place. Because Lucas Hayes had made that very clear, hadn't he? Standing there with that bored expression, that half-lidded gaze like nothing in the room could touch him, saying it so easily, it almost sounded like truth. He's just a game. Like I was something temporary, something disposable. Something you played with when you were bored and dropped the second something better came along. And I had believed him. God, I had believed him enough to try and walk away, to download apps, to swipe right on strangers with easy smiles and normal lives. People who didn't look at me like they already knew how this would end. But then things started slipping, small at first, easy to ignore, a canceled date here. A number that suddenly didn't work anymore. A guy who unmatched me without a word. After what felt like a perfect night, and I told myself not to read into it, not to be that person, the one who turns rejection into conspiracy. But patterns have a way of tightening around your throat when you ignore them too long. And tonight it finally snapped into something I couldn't pretend away, because I found him, one of them, standing under the flickering light of a parking garage, shoulders tight, eyes darting like he was waiting for something to come out of the dark. And when he saw me, when our eyes met, something in his face shifted, not anger, not annoyance, something closer to fear, and he shook his head before I could even speak, like he already knew what I was going to ask, like he'd been told what to say. Don't call me again, he muttered, voice low, strained, like the words tasted wrong in his mouth, and I felt it then, that cold, creeping realization that this wasn't about me anymore. Or maybe it had always been, just not in the way I thought, because across the lot, leaning against the hood of a black car like he had all the time in the world, Lucas was watching, not hiding, not even trying to pretend he wasn't there, just watching, eyes steady, unreadable, like. This was exactly where he expected me to be, exactly the moment he'd been waiting for. And suddenly every failed attempt, every strange look made sense in the worst possible way, because games don't end when you walk away from them, not when someone else is still playing. And the way Lucas straightened, the way his gaze locked onto mine, slow and deliberate, made my pulse stutter in my throat, because that wasn't indifference, that wasn't boredom, that was control, quiet and absolute, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself to be real. And I didn't move, couldn't move, because something in me already knew that whatever was happening, whatever he had done, it wasn't going to stop just because I finally noticed it. And the worst part, the part one didn't want to admit even to myself, was that I wasn't sure if I wanted it to. Lucas did not look surprised when I started walking toward him, and that was the first thing that made my chest tighten, not fear exactly, but something sharper, something that felt like recognition arriving too late, like I had stepped into a moment he had already lived through a dozen times in his head. And as the distance between us closed, the air seemed to shift, heavy in a way that made every step feel louder than it should have been. My shoes echoing faintly against the concrete like I was announcing myself, like I was walking into something I could not take back. And he just watched, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed, like this was nothing more than a casual meeting, like I had not just watched another person pull away from me, like I carried consequences instead of conversation. And I hated that calm, hated the way it made everything else feel smaller, less real, because it meant he knew something I did not. And I stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the way the overhead light caught in his eyes, turning them colder than I remembered, or maybe I had just never looked long enough to notice before. And for a second, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching thin and tight, like it was waiting for me to snap first, which I did. Of course I did, because I always do, my voice coming out sharper than I intended, asking him what the hell was going on. Why every person I tried to get close to suddenly acted like I was a problem they needed to escape. And he tilted his head slightly, like he was considering the question instead of avoiding it, like he was deciding how much of the truth I was ready to hear. And that should have been my warning, That should have been the moment I turned around and left, but I stayed. Because part of me needed to hear it out loud, needed confirmation that I was not. Imagining the pattern that had been tightening around me for weeks. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost thoughtful. It was not a coincidence, he said, like he was explaining something simple, something obvious, and my stomach dropped. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a slow, sinking weight that made it harder to breathe, because he was not denying it. He was not even pretending. And I took a step closer without thinking, searching his face for something that looked like hesitation, like doubt, anything that suggested this was not as controlled as it felt. But there was nothing, just that same quiet focus, like I was the only thing in his line of sight, like everything else had already been handled. And I asked him why, because that was the only question that mattered now. Why would you do that? Why would you interfere? And for a moment, something shifted, not in his expression, but in the way he looked at me, like the answer was obvious to him in a way it was not to me, like I was the one missing something fundamental. And he took a step forward, closing the space between us until I could feel the heat of him. Without him touching me, and my pulse jumped, stupid and unhelpful. Because this was not supposed to feel like this. This was supposed to feel like anger, like confrontation, but instead it felt like standing too close to something I did not fully understand. And he said my name, quiet, almost careful, like he was testing how it sounded in the air between us. And then he asked me a question instead of answering mine. Did you really think I would just watch? And the words landed wrong, not because they were loud or aggressive, but because they were calm, like this had never been a choice for him, like this was simply how things were. And I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him this was not his decision to make, that my life was not something he could control, but the words stalled somewhere behind my teeth, because the way he was looking at me made it hard to remember what normal was supposed to feel like. And for the first time, I realized this might not have started when I tried to leave. This might not have been a reaction at all. And that thought settled in deep, quiet, and terrifying, because it meant I had been standing in the middle of something much longer than I ever noticed, and I did not know if I was just now seeing it, or if he was finally letting me. The question hung between us longer than it should have, heavy and deliberate, like he already knew I was not going to answer it the way he wanted. And maybe that was the point. Maybe he did not need my answer at all, because the way Lucas watched me felt less like curiosity and more like confirmation, like every reaction I had was something he had already predicted, already accounted for. And that realization made something in my chest tighten in a way that was not entirely fear, because fear would have been easier, cleaner, something I could have used as an excuse to walk away. But this was messier. This was awareness creeping in where denial used to be, and I forced myself to speak anyway, telling him that none of this made sense, that people do not just disappear from someone's life without a reason, that whatever he thought he was doing, it was not his place. And my voice sounded steadier than I felt, which almost made it worse, because it gave the illusion that I was still in control of this conversation. And Lucas listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on me in that same quiet way, like he was letting me finish a thought he had already heard before. And when I stopped, when the words ran out and left that same stretched silence behind, he exhaled slowly, not frustrated, not impatient, just measured, like he was deciding how far to push. And then he said something that should not have made my pulse spike the way it did. You are still trying to make this about choice. And I frowned, because of course it was about choice. What else could it be? But the way he said it made it sound like I was missing something obvious, something fundamental. And I asked him what that was supposed to mean, even though part of me was not sure I wanted to hear the answer. And he stepped a little closer, not enough to touch, but enough that the space between us felt intentional, controlled, like distance itself was something he adjusted when he felt like it. And his voice dropped slightly, softer but not gentler. There is a difference, he said, between wanting something and allowing it to happen. And the words settled in slowly, confusing at first, because I had not asked for any of this. I had not wanted my life narrowed down to a series of almosts and maybes. I had not wanted to stand here trying to understand why someone else thought they had a say in who I could or could not get close to. And I told him that, more quietly now, because the anger was starting to thin into something else, something less certain. And Lucas's expression shifted just enough that I noticed, not softer, not kinder, but sharper, like I had finally said something worth responding to. And he shook his head slightly, almost amused, like I was still standing on the edge of something I refused to step into. You think this started when you decided to move on, he said, and the way he phrased it made my stomach drop again, because that was not an answer, that was a correction, and I felt my thoughts stumble over themselves, trying to line up. Everything that had happened, every look, every moment I had brushed off as coincidence. Every time Lucas had been there without being part of anything. Just close enough to notice, never close enough to question, and suddenly those memories felt different, heavier, like they had been building towards something I had not been paying attention to. And I realized I did not actually know when this started. Not really, not in any way that mattered. And the admission sat there, unspoken but loud. Because he could see it, of course he could see it, the way my expression shifted, the way my certainty cracked just enough to let something else in. And Lucas stepped back then, just a fraction, like he was giving me space to think, or maybe just enough distance to watch what I did next. And that somehow felt worse, because it meant this was not about forcing anything, not in the obvious way. This was about waiting, about letting me catch up to something he had already decided, and I stood there, trying to hold on to the version of this that still made sense, trying to tell myself that I could walk away, that I could choose not to be part of whatever this was becoming. But the thought felt thinner now, less solid than it had before, because for the first time, I was not sure if walking away would actually change anything, or if it would just prove that he had been right all along. For a second, nothing moved except the hum of the overhead light and the faint echo of a car passing somewhere above us. And I told myself that was my chance. That this was the moment normal people would take, the moment where you step back, shake your head, and walk away from something that feels too complicated, too controlled, too far outside the lines of what should make sense. But my feet did not move, and that bothered me more than anything Lucas had said so far, because it meant this was not just about him anymore. It was about me standing here, choosing not to leave even when every logical part of my brain was listing reasons why I should. And I forced myself to take a breath, steady, deliberate, trying to ground myself in something that felt real, something I could hold on to that was not just his voice or the way he seemed to occupy space like it belonged to him. And I told him this was not how things worked, that people do not get to decide other people's lives like this, that whatever he thought this was, it was not something I agreed to. And the words sounded right. They sounded like the kind of thing you were supposed to say in a situation like this. But even as I said them, I could feel how thin they were, how little they seemed to matter in the space between us. And Lucas's gaze did not waver, did not soften. It just stayed on me, steady and patient in a way that felt almost worse than anger would have. Because anger you can fight, anger you can push against. But this felt like something already settled, something that did not need to raise its voice to be understood. And he took a slow step closer again, closing that small distance I had not even realized I had tried to create. And my pulse jumped in response, sharp and immediate, because every movement he made felt intentional, like nothing about this was accidental. Not the space, not the timing, not the way he let silence sit just long enough to make me feel it. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter now, almost conversational, like we were discussing something simple instead of something that had completely unraveled the last few weeks of my life. You keep talking about agreement like it was ever part of this. And I felt something in my chest twist at that, because it was such a small sentence, but it carried something heavier underneath it, something that suggested this had never been about asking, never been about waiting for permission. And I opened my mouth to argue again, to push back, to tell him that was exactly the problem. But the word stalled, caught somewhere between instinct and doubt, because the longer I stood here, the more the edges of this situation blurred. The clearer it became that I had missed something earlier, something important, and I hated that feeling, hated not knowing where the line had been drawn or when I had crossed it. And Lucas watched that realization settle in. I could see it in the slight shift of his expression, not satisfaction exactly, but something close, something that said this was the reaction he had been expecting. And he tilted his head just slightly, studying me in a way that felt too close, too focused, like I was something he had been paying attention to for a long time, longer than I had ever realized. And the thought made my stomach tighten, because it meant all those moments I had brushed off, all those times I had felt his presence without really acknowledging it, might not have been as insignificant as I told myself. And I swallowed, forcing myself to hold his gaze even as it made something in me feel exposed. Because if I looked away now, it would feel like losing ground I did not even understand yet. And he noticed that too. Of course he did. The way I stayed. The way I did not step back this time. And something about that seemed to shift the air between us again, subtle but real. Like a line had been crossed without either of us needing to say it out loud. And then he said my name again, softer. This time, not a question, not even a warning, just a statement. Like he was anchoring me there. Like he wanted to see if I would respond the way I always had before. And the worst part was, I did. I always did. Because my attention snapped to him automatically. Because no matter how much I tried to frame this as something I could walk away from, something I could reject, my body was already reacting in ways I had not given permission for. And that was the moment it clicked, not all at once, but enough to make my chest feel tight, enough to make the situation shift from confusing to something else entirely. Because this was not just about what he had done, it was about how long he had been able to do it without me seeing it, without me stopping it. And the realization did not come with panic like I expected. It came with something quieter, something more dangerous, because instead of pulling away, I found myself asking a different question, one I had not been ready to admit even to myself before. And when I spoke, my voice was lower, less certain but more honest. I asked him how long, and the way his expression changed, just barely, told me I had finally asked the right thing. Lucas did not answer right away, and the silence that followed was different this time, heavier, like it carried something real instead of just tension, and I felt my heartbeat shift, slow but louder in my ears, because I knew, somehow, that whatever he said next was going to change the shape of everything I thought I understood about this, about him, about us, if there even was an us to begin with. And he looked at me like he was measuring something, like he was deciding how much truth I could handle without stepping back again. And that thought alone should have irritated me, should have made me push harder, demand a clear answer. But instead I stayed quiet, waiting, because for the first time I did not feel like I was chasing the truth. It felt like it was about to step forward on its own. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost detached, like he was stating a fact instead of revealing something personal. Longer than you think, and the words settled in slowly, not dramatic, not sharp, just steady and inevitable, like something I should have already known. And I frowned, because that was not an answer, not really. It was vague in a way that felt intentional, like he was giving me just enough to understand without handing me the full picture. And I pushed again, asking him what that meant, how long exactly, because this mattered. This was not something you could brush off with a half answer. But Lucas did not move, did not shift. He just watched me with that same quiet focus. And then he said something that made my thoughts stall completely. Since before you noticed me. And for a second, I was not sure I heard him correctly, because that did not make sense. That rewrote everything. That suggested this had not started with the moments I could remember, not with the late-night conversations or the tension that built between us over time, but before that, something earlier, something I had not even registered as important, and my mind scrambled, trying to go back, trying to trace the timeline, to find a point where this could have begun without me realizing it. And I hated how little I could find, how many small moments blurred together now that I was looking at them differently. Like I had missed the pattern because I never thought there was one to begin with. And I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him, because that could not be right. People do not just decide something like that. They do not just step into someone else's life without being seen, without being acknowledged. And yet here he was, standing in front of me like this had always been inevitable, like I was the last one to understand what had already been set in motion. And I felt something shift inside me, not fear exactly, but something close to it, something that made it harder to separate what I should feel from what I actually felt, because part of me was still trying to push back, still trying to frame this as something wrong, something I could reject, but another part, quieter and more dangerous, was starting to recognize the consistency, the way he had been there, always just within reach, never forcing, never obvious, just present in a way that now felt deliberate instead of coincidental. And I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, because the question I had asked had not given me clarity. It had opened something else entirely, something that stretched further back than I was ready to look. And Lucas took a small step forward again, not closing the space completely, just enough to remind me that he could That distance was still something he controlled if he wanted to, and his voice dropped slightly, softer but no less certain. You think this is about who you choose to date? And I did not answer, because I was starting to understand that it was not really, that this was bigger than that, deeper, rooted somewhere I had not paid attention to. And he watched that realization settle in. The way my expression shifted, the way my certainty faltered just enough to let something else in. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would make this simpler. And I realized then that the question I should have been asking was not how long, but why me? Why him? Why this? And the fact that I had not asked it yet, that I was still standing here instead of walking away, told me more about myself than anything he had said so far. The question lingered in my mind longer than anything else he had said, stretching out in the silence between us like it had been waiting for me to notice it. And the more I thought about it, the more everything else started to feel secondary, because it did not matter how long this had been happening if I did not understand why it was happening at all. And I could feel that shift in myself, the way my focus narrowed, the way the confusion started to sharpen into something more specific, more dangerous, because this was no longer just about reacting to what Lucas had done. It was about understanding what he wanted, and that felt like stepping closer to something I might not be able to step back from. And I took a slow breath, steadying myself before I spoke again, asking him the question that had been building under everything else. Why me? And for the first time since this conversation started, Lucas did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing how to say it. And that alone made my chest tighten, because it meant the answer mattered. It meant there was something there that he did not just throw out casually. And he looked at me differently then, not softer, not kinder, but more focused, like he was finally addressing something he had not needed to explain before. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but it carried more weight than anything he had said so far. You are asking the wrong question again. And I felt a flicker of frustration rise, because it seemed like every time I tried to get a straight answer, he shifted the ground under me, made it about something else, something I had not considered yet. And I told him that was not fair, that I had the right to understand what was happening in my own life. And he watched me for a second, like he was considering that, like he was measuring how much of that statement he agreed with. And then he stepped closer again, just enough to make me aware of him in a way I could not ignore. And he said something that made everything else fall quiet for a moment. It is not about why you. It is about why not you. And the words hit differently than I expected, not like an explanation, but like a shift in perspective I had not been prepared for, because it suggested there was no specific reason, no single moment that triggered all of this. It suggested something broader, something that had been building without me realizing it. And I shook my head slightly, trying to process that, because it did not feel like an answer. It felt like something I had to unpack on my own. And I told him that did not make sense, that people do not just choose someone without a reason, without something that makes that person different from everyone else. And Lucas's expression changed just enough that I caught it. Not disagreement, not correction, something closer to certainty, like he had already considered that argument and dismissed it. And he said that was where I was wrong, because it was not about me being different, it was about me being consistent. And that word stayed with me longer than anything else, consistent, because it did not sound like a compliment. It sounded like something observed, something tracked over time, and I felt a slow realization start to form, uncomfortable and undeniable, because consistency meant repetition, it meant patterns, it meant that this had not been built on one moment, but many, small and seemingly insignificant at the time. And I tried to think back, to find those moments, to understand what he had seen, that I had not. And the more I tried, the more I realized how little I had paid attention, how easily I had moved through those interactions without considering what they might mean to someone watching from the outside. And Lucas saw that shift in me. Of course he did. The way my thoughts slowed, the way my certainty gave way to something more reflective, and he did not interrupt, did not push, he just let it happen. Like he knew this part mattered more than anything he could say. And the silence between us changed again, less tense, more weighted, like it was holding something real now, something that neither of us needed to rush. And I realized then that this was not about him forcing me into anything, not in the way I had first thought. This was about him waiting, watching, letting me reach a point where I could no longer ignore what was already there. And that understanding settled in slowly, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady and impossible to dismiss. And for the first time since this started, I was not sure if I was trying to escape this situation or understand it. And that difference felt like the most dangerous shift of all. The word consistent stayed with me longer than it should have, echoing quietly in the back of my mind as I stood there trying to piece together a version of events that actually made sense. But the more I tried, the more I realized how little I had been paying attention before, how easily I had dismissed the small things, the repeated moments where Lucas had been there without really being part of anything, always close enough to notice, never close enough to question, and now those same moments felt different, heavier, like they had been building towards something I had not been ready to see. And I hated that feeling, hated the way it made me question my own memory, my own awareness, because it meant this had been happening right in front of me and I had not recognized it for what it was. And I looked at him again, really looked this time, not just at his expression, but at the way he held himself, the way nothing about him seemed rushed or uncertain, like he had already worked through every possible reaction I could have, like he was not waiting to see what I would do. He was waiting to see when I would catch up, and that thought settled somewhere deep, uncomfortable and sharp, because it shifted the dynamic in a way I was not prepared for. And I asked him what that meant, what he had been watching for, what exactly he thought he had seen that I had not. And my voice came out quieter than before, less confrontational, more focused, because this was not about arguing anymore. This was about understanding something that had already taken shape whether I agreed with it or not. And Lucas did not look away, did not hesitate. He just held my gaze with that same steady intensity and said, "You always come back." And for a second I did not understand what he meant, because that did not line up with anything I had been thinking, anything I had been trying to figure out. And I frowned slightly, trying to process it, because I had been trying to leave, trying to move on, trying to put distance between us. So how could he say that like it was a fact, like it was something proven? And he must have seen that confusion, because he took a small step closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to make sure I did not miss what he said next, and his voice dropped slightly, softer but more certain. "You leave," he said, "but you do not stay gone." And the words landed differently, not as an accusation, not even as a claim, but as an observation, something he had been tracking over time. And I felt something shift again, because I could not immediately deny it, not completely, because even now, standing here with every reason to walk away, I had not moved. I had stayed. I had followed the thread back to him instead of cutting it off. And that realization settled in slowly, heavier than I expected, because it meant this was not one-sided in the way I had been telling myself. It meant there was something in my own behavior that had contributed to this, something I had not fully acknowledged. And I shook my head slightly, more out of instinct than certainty, because I did not want that to be true. I did not want this to be something I had played a part in without realizing it. And I told him that was different. That coming back did not mean what he thought it did, that it did not justify what he had been doing, and Lucas listened. But there was something in his expression now that felt more settled, more assured, like he was not trying to convince me of anything anymore, like he had already reached his conclusion and was simply waiting for me to see it. And he nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like he understood what I was saying without accepting it as a counterpoint. And then he said something that made everything else feel quieter by comparison. I never needed it to justify anything. And the simplicity of that statement hit harder than I expected, because it meant this had never been about proving something, never been about building a case or waiting for the right moment. It had just been steady and consistent in the background of everything else. And I felt my breath catch slightly, because that kind of certainty was not something you could argue with, not easily, not without understanding where it came from. And for the first time, I realized that this was not just about him watching me. It was about him understanding me in ways I had not taken the time to understand myself. And that thought settled in with a weight that felt both grounding and unsettling at the same time, because it meant I was no longer just reacting to his actions. I was starting to recognize the pattern he had been seeing all along, and the more I saw it, the harder it became to pretend it was not there. The silence that followed felt different again, but this time it was not heavy or tense. It was steady, like something had settled into place without either of us needing to say it out loud. And I could feel that shift inside myself, subtle but undeniable, because the more Lucas spoke, the more the situation stopped feeling like something being forced on me and started feeling like something I had been circling around without realizing it. And that thought should have been unsettling. It should have made me pull back, reestablish distance, remind myself that none of this was normal, but instead it made everything sharper, clearer in a way that was harder to ignore, and I exhaled slowly, trying to sort through what I was feeling without letting it show too much on my face. Because I knew he was watching. I knew he noticed every small reaction, every hesitation, every shift in my expression, and I was not ready to give him that much control, not completely, and I told him that even if what he said was true, even if I had come back before, that did not mean I would keep doing it, that it did not mean he got to decide what happened next, and my voice came out more grounded this time, more certain, like I was trying to anchor myself in something that felt like choice again, something that felt like mine, and Lucas listened. Without interrupting, his gaze steady, unreadable, but there was something there now, something quieter, like he was not dismissing what I said, just placing it somewhere in a pattern he already understood, and he nodded slightly, almost like he was acknowledging the effort more than the statement itself. And then he said something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. "You are right. You do not have to come back." And for a moment, that felt like relief, like an opening, like something I could take and use to step away from all of this. But it did not last, because he continued, his voice still calm, still even, but carrying something deeper underneath it. "You just have not proven that you will not." And the words landed quietly, but they hit harder than anything else he had said so far, because they did not trap me. They did not force me into anything. They simply reflected something back at me that I had not fully accepted yet, and I felt my thoughts stall again. Not because I did not understand, but because I did, more than I wanted to admit, and I looked away for a second, just long enough to break that direct line of focus between us, because it was starting to feel too precise, too controlled, like standing in front of a mirror that showed more than I was ready to see. And I glanced around the parking garage, at the empty spaces, the distant flicker of light, anything that felt normal, anything that reminded me that this was still the real world, and not just this strange, narrowing conversation, but even that felt thinner now, less grounding than it should have been, because the center of my attention kept pulling back to him, to the way he stood there like none of this was uncertain, like the outcome had never been in question for him. And I hated that, hated the idea that he could be so sure about something I was still trying to understand, and I turned back to him, forcing myself to meet his gaze again, because looking away felt too much like giving in, like stepping back without actually moving, and I told him that he did not get to decide that for me, that I would prove him wrong if I had to, that I could walk away and stay gone if I chose to. And the words felt stronger when I said them, like I was reclaiming something I had almost let slip, and for a second, I expected him to challenge that, to push back, to argue, but he did not. He just watched me with that same quiet intensity, and then something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, like he had been waiting for exactly that response, and he said, almost softly, "Then do it." And the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because it was not resistance, it was not control, it was permission, or something that looked like it. And that made it more complicated, not less, because now it was not about escaping something he was forcing, it was about proving something to both of us. And I felt my breath catch slightly as that realization settled in, because walking away suddenly felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more weight than just leaving a conversation behind. And for the first time, I understood what he meant. About consistency, about patterns, about the way things repeat, even when you tell yourself they will not. And the thought lingered, quiet and persistent, as I stood there trying to decide what I was actually going to do next. For a moment, neither of us moved, and that stillness felt louder than anything that had been said so far, because now there was nothing left to hide behind. No more questions to delay what came next, just a choice sitting between us like it had always been there, waiting for me to notice it, and I became acutely aware of everything at once, the faint hum of the lights above, the cool air brushing against my skin, the way my pulse had not slowed down since I walked toward him, like my body already understood something my mind was still trying to catch up to, and I told myself to move, to take the step back, to turn around and prove that I could, that his certainty did not define what I did next, but my feet stayed planted for just a second too long, And that hesitation felt heavier than anything else, because I knew he saw it. I knew he registered that pause, the way I had not immediately taken the out he gave me. And I hated that, hated how exposed it made me feel without him needing to say a word. And I forced myself to shift my weight, to take a small step back, just enough to create space, just enough to remind both of us that I could still move if I chose to. And his gaze followed that movement, not surprised, not concerned, just observant, like he was tracking something he had already expected. And I told him this was it, that I was done with whatever this was, that I was not going to keep standing here trying to decode something that should have never happened in the first place. And the words sounded right. They sounded final. But there was something underneath them that felt less certain, something that made them land softer than I intended. And Lucas did not argue, did not step forward to close the distance again. He just stayed where he was, watching me with that same steady focus. And then he nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he was acknowledging the decision without questioning it. And that should have made it easier. It should have made this simple. But it did the opposite, because there was no resistance, no push, nothing to push against. Just that quiet acceptance that made everything feel less like an escape and more like a test. And I turned away then, finally, because staying any longer felt like giving something up that I was not ready to name. And I started walking, each step measured, controlled, like I was making sure there was no hesitation this time, like I was proving something with every foot of distance I put between us. And I did not look back, not at first, because I knew if I did, it would mean something. It would confirm something I was still trying to deny. And the silence behind me stretched, no footsteps following, no voice calling me back, just empty space where he had been standing. And that should have made it easier. It should have made this feel like a clean break. But instead it felt incomplete, like something had not finished yet. And I clenched my jaw slightly, focusing on the exit ahead, the faint glow of light marking the way out of the garage, telling myself that once I stepped outside, once I put enough distance between this moment and everything that led up to it, it would settle, it would make sense again, I would go back to normal, whatever that meant now. But the thought did not feel as solid as it should have. It felt thin, like something I was repeating instead of believing. And just before I reached the edge of the light, I slowed, barely noticeable, just enough that it caught my own attention. And I hated that too. Hated the way my body seemed to hesitate without my permission, like there was something still pulling at me from behind, something I had not fully cut off yet. And for a second, I told myself to keep going, to ignore it, to step forward and not look back. But the silence behind me felt too deliberate, too intentional, like it was waiting for something. And before I could stop myself, I turned my head slightly, just enough to look over my shoulder, just enough to see him again, still standing there exactly where I had left him, exactly as calm, exactly as certain, like nothing about this outcome had surprised him at all. And our eyes met across the distance. And in that single moment, something shifted again, something quiet but undeniable, because he did not move, did not call out, did not try to stop me. He just looked at me like he already knew what I was about to do next. And the worst part was, I was not entirely sure he was wrong. The moment our eyes met again, something in my chest tightened in a way that felt too immediate to ignore, like the distance I had just created between us did not matter as much as I wanted it to, like it had never been the real point to begin with. And I turned my head forward again quickly, almost too quickly, like I could shake off the feeling if I moved fast enough, like momentum alone could carry me out of whatever this was. And I stepped into the light at the edge of the garage, the brightness hitting my eyes just enough to force a blink, just enough to break that connection for a second. And I told myself that was it, that this was where it ended, that whatever he thought he understood about me, whatever pattern he believed in, it stopped here, because I was choosing something different. I was choosing to walk away and stay gone. And I focused on that thought as I moved forward, each step measured, deliberate, like I was reinforcing the decision with every inch of distance. And for a moment, it almost worked, almost felt real, like I could slip back into something familiar, something simple. But then the silence behind me stretched again, not empty, not neutral, but intentional in a way that made it feel like part of the conversation had followed me out, like something unfinished was still attached. And I clenched my jaw slightly, because I knew what that feeling meant. I knew it too well now. It was the same pull I had ignored before, the same quiet thread that led me back without me realizing it. And I told myself not to turn around again, not to look, because that would only prove his point. It would confirm everything he had said about patterns, about consistency, about the way I always came back, and I refused to give him that. Refused to make it that easy, and I kept walking, out of the garage, into the open air, the night cooler, wider, more real, like it should have grounded me, like it should have made everything feel distant and manageable again. But it did not, because the awareness stayed, sharp and present, like something I could not set down just because I changed locations, and I slowed without meaning to, just slightly, just enough to notice it myself. And that irritation flared again, because I hated how aware I had become of my own movements, how every small hesitation felt significant now, like it carried meaning I could not ignore anymore. And I forced myself to keep going, to move past it, to get to the end of the block, to put enough space between me and that moment that it would finally lose its grip. But the thought did not settle. It lingered, persistent and quiet, because it was not just about distance. It was about understanding, and I had not fully reached that yet, not completely. And that realization made something shift again, because walking away no longer felt like the final answer. It felt like part of the process, like something incomplete, and I stopped, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a gradual pause that felt more like giving in than deciding. And I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the cooler air, because I knew what came next. I knew what this meant even before I turned around. And for a second, I hesitated, not because I did not know what I was about to do, but because I did, because this was the exact moment he had been talking about, the exact point where leaving and staying blurred into the same thing. And I closed my eyes briefly, just long, enough to gather something that felt like control, something that felt like it belonged to me. And then I turned, fully this time, not just a glance over my shoulder, but a complete shift, facing the direction I had just come from. And even from here, even with the distance, I could see him, still there, still exactly where I had left him, like nothing about this had changed for him at all. And the sight of that did something to me I was not prepared for, because it was not surprising, not really. It felt expected in a way that made everything else click into place, like this was always how it was going to go. And I started walking back, slow at first, then more certain, because the hesitation had already happened. The decision had already been made in that moment. I stopped, and with every step closer, the noise in my head quieted, not because I had answers, but because I had accepted the direction I was moving in. And when I finally reached him again, standing just a few feet away, the space between us felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, just charged with something neither of us needed to name. And he looked at me the same way he had before, calm, steady, like this had never been in doubt. And I held his gaze, not trying to argue this time, not trying to push back, just meeting it with something closer to acknowledgement. And for the first time, I understood what he had meant, not completely, not fully, but enough to recognize that this was not just about him anymore. And that realization settled in quietly, heavier than anything else that had been said, because it meant I was no longer standing outside of this, I was part of it. Now, whether I liked that or not, standing in front of him again felt different this time, not because anything around us had changed, but because something inside me had shifted in a way I could not undo. Like a line I had been trying to stay behind had quietly dissolved the moment I turned back, and I could feel that awareness settle into place, steady and undeniable, because this was no longer about proving him wrong or escaping a situation I did not understand. This was about facing something I had already stepped into, something I had chosen the moment I stopped walking away. And Lucas did not say anything right away. He did not need to, because the fact that I was standing here again said more than any explanation I could have given, and I hated how obvious that felt, hated how transparent my actions must look from his perspective, but at the same time, I could not bring myself to regret it, not completely. And that contradiction sat quietly in my chest, heavier than I expected, because it meant this was not as simple as I had tried to make it, not something I could just label as wrong and walk away from without consequence. And I held his gaze, forcing myself not to look away this time, because if I did, it would feel like slipping back into the same uncertainty I had been trying to escape, and I needed to understand this, needed to meet it head-on even if I did not like what I might find. And I asked him what happened now, my voice lower, more controlled, because the question was no longer about what he had done. It was about what this meant moving forward. And Lucas studied me for a second, like he was considering the weight of that question, like he recognized that something had changed in the way I was asking it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was something different in it now, something less distant, not softer exactly, but more direct, like he was no longer speaking around the truth. You decide, he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard again. Because after everything, after all the control, all the certainty he had shown, I had not expected that answer, not in that form, and I frowned. Slightly, trying to reconcile that with everything else he had said, because it did not feel like I had been deciding anything so far. It felt like I had been catching up to something already in motion, and I told him that, more quietly than before, because the frustration had shifted into something else, something closer to confusion, and Lucas shook his head slightly, not dismissive, just certain, like he understood the difference better than I did. You always were, he said, and the words landed differently this time. Not like a challenge, not like something meant to provoke me, but like a statement I had not recognized until now. And I thought about that, about every moment that had led here, every time I had chosen to engage instead of ignore, every time I had followed the thread instead of cutting it. And I could not deny it completely, not anymore, because even now, I was here because I had come back, because I had decided to turn around instead of keep walking, and that realization did not feel like losing control the way I expected. It felt like something else entirely, something that made the situation clearer instead of more chaotic, and I exhaled slowly, letting that settle in, because it meant I was not as powerless in this as I had thought, even if the path had not been as obvious as I wanted it to be. And I looked at him again, really looked this time, not trying to figure him out, not trying to decode his intentions, but just seeing him as he was, steady, patient, certain in a way that no longer felt entirely separate from me. And I realized then that this was not about him forcing anything on me, not anymore. This was about what I chose to do with what I now understood, and that thought felt heavier than anything else, because it meant there was no easy answer, no simple way to step back into something familiar. And for a moment, I considered leaving again, testing it, proving that I could still walk away if I wanted to, but the idea felt hollow now, less convincing than before, because I already knew what would happen. I already knew where that path would lead, and the repetition of it no longer felt like escape. It felt like avoidance, and I was not sure I wanted that anymore. And Lucas watched me through all of it, quiet, attentive, like he could see the shift happening in real time, like he was waiting for me to reach a conclusion I had been circling for longer than I realized. And when I finally spoke again, my voice was steadier than I expected, not because I had all the answers, but because I had stopped trying to avoid the question, and I told him I was still here. And the words felt simple, but they carried more weight than anything else I had said so far, because this time, they were not just a reaction, they were a decision. The words settled between us with a weight that felt almost tangible, like they had shifted something fundamental in the space we were standing in. And for the first time since this started, the silence did not feel like something to fill or escape. It felt like something to sit in, something that acknowledged what had already been said without needing to push it further. And Lucas did not respond immediately, but I saw it. The slight change in the way he looked at me, not surprise, not even satisfaction, something quieter, something more certain, like a piece had finally fallen into place exactly where he expected it to. And that realization should have made me uneasy. It should have made me second-guess what I had just admitted, but it did not, because the more I stood here, the more it felt like I had already crossed the point where doubt would have changed anything. And I became aware of how close we were again, not touching, but close enough that the distance felt intentional, rather than necessary, like something that could be closed or widened depending on what came next. And I did not step back this time. I did not try to create space that would only highlight the lack of it, because pretending there was distance now felt pointless, and Lucas noticed that. Of course he did. The way my posture stayed steady, the way I held his gaze without shifting, without looking for an exit, and he exhaled slowly, a small, controlled breath that felt like the release of something that had been held in place for longer than I understood. And then he said my name again, not as a question, not as a call, just a statement, like he was grounding the moment in something real. And I felt the way my attention locked onto that, automatic and immediate. And this time, I did not fight it, did not try to frame it as something outside my control, because I understood now that it was part of it, part of the pattern he had been talking about, part of the reason we were standing here instead of anywhere else. And I asked him what that meant for him, because I had spent so much time trying to understand what this meant for me, what I was choosing, what I was acknowledging, that I had not actually asked what he intended to do with it. And the question felt important in a different way, less defensive, more direct, because this was no longer about figuring out what had happened. It was about what came next, and Lucas watched me for a moment, like he was weighing the answer, like he understood that this was not just curiosity, it was expectation, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something deeper in it now, something that felt less distant than before. It means I do not need to pretend anymore. And the words were simple, but they carried a shift that I felt immediately, because everything up until now had been layered, indirect, built on observation and inference. But this was clear in a way that left no space to misinterpret it, and I felt my breath catch slightly. Not because I did not understand, but because I did, because it meant whatever boundaries had existed before, whatever unspoken lines we had both been navigating around, were no longer in place the way they had been. And I held his gaze, trying to measure what that meant in real terms, not just in the abstract way this conversation had unfolded so far. And I asked him what he would do differently, because that was the only way to make sense of it, the only way to ground it in something I could actually respond to. And Lucas stepped a fraction closer, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to make the shift undeniable, and his voice dropped slightly, quieter but more certain than anything he had said before. I stopped waiting, and the simplicity of that answer landed heavier than I expected, because it was not a threat, it was not a demand, it was a statement of intent, and I felt something in my chest tighten again, not from fear, but from the realization of what that implied, because waiting had been the structure of everything up until now. The distance, the observation, the patience, and removing that changed the entire dynamic, made it immediate in a way that was harder to step back from. And I realized then that this was the moment where everything shifted from something I could analyze into something I had to experience, something I had to actively choose to stay in or leave behind. And the weight of that settled in slowly, steady, and undeniable, because for the first time, I could see the shape of what this might become, not clearly, not completely, but enough to understand that it was no longer something happening around me. It was something happening with me. And the difference between those two felt like the most important thing I had realized all night. For a moment, everything felt still in a way that did not belong to the world around us, like the city had faded just enough to leave only this space, this moment, this choice hanging between us. And I could feel the weight of what he said settle deeper the longer I stood there, because it was not just about him anymore, not just about what he had been doing or how long it had been happening. It was about what came next, about what I was willing to step into now that I understood it. And I became aware of my own breathing again, slow but uneven, like my body was trying to keep up with a decision my mind had not fully finished making yet. And I told myself to think, to step back mentally even if I did not physically move, to analyze this the way I had been trying to from the beginning. But the clarity I expected did not come, not in the way I thought it would, because this was not something that could be solved like a problem. It was something that had to be accepted or rejected. And the simplicity of that realization made everything else feel sharper, more immediate, because there was no middle ground left to stand on. And I looked at Lucas again, not searching this time, not trying to figure him out, just seeing him as he was, steady, certain, no longer waiting in the same way he had been before. And that difference mattered, because it meant the dynamic had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not fear, not exactly, but something close to anticipation, something that made the air feel thinner when I took a breath, and I hated how much that conflicted with everything I thought I should feel, because this was not simple. It was not safe in the way I understood safety, but it was real in a way I could not ignore anymore. And that mattered more than I expected it to. And I realized then that I had been asking the wrong questions from the start. Not how long, not why, not even what he had been doing, but whether I was willing to stay once I understood it. And that answer was already forming whether I wanted it to or not, because I had come back. I had chosen to stand here instead of walking away. And I had not done that out of confusion, not entirely. I had done it because part of me needed to see this through, needed to understand where it led instead of pretending it did not exist. And that thought settled into something steadier, something that felt more like a decision than a reaction. And I exhaled slowly, letting that clarity take shape without rushing it. Because for the first time, I was not trying to escape the moment, I was letting it happen. And when I spoke again, my voice was quieter but more certain than it had been all night. Not because I had all the answers, but because I had stopped trying to avoid them. And I told him I was not leaving. Not this time. Not like before. And the words felt different as soon as they left my mouth. Heavier, more grounded, because they were not just a response to him. They were a reflection of something I had already accepted. And Lucas did not react the way I expected. He did not move closer, did not say anything right away. He just held my gaze with that same steady focus. But there was something new there now, something less distant, something that felt like acknowledgement rather than observation. And that shift was subtle, but it was enough to confirm that this was no longer just a pattern he had been watching. It was something we were both actively part of now. And the realization settled in with a quiet finality, because it meant there was no going back to the version of this where I could pretend it was one-sided, where I could frame it as something happening to me instead of something I was choosing to stay in. And I became aware of the space between us again, not as distance, but as something deliberate, something that no longer felt like a boundary, but like a pause, a moment before whatever came next. And I knew that moment would not last, that it was already shifting, already moving forward in a direction I had finally stopped resisting. And for the first time, I did not try to stop it, because the truth was, I had never really wanted to.